Isn't this a great state? I mean, really, that we can do this and celebrate J. Frank Dobie and all of the wonderful things. So I've known about J. Frank Dobie most of my life. My father was born in 1878, really, and 10 years before Dobie, and he died in 1964, the same year that Dobie died. He was a cowboy on a ranch in Eagle Lake, Texas, and once we moved into the suburbs, J. Frank Dobie's books were always around because he just loved that life. Never really gave it up. My mom, I remember one time he was sitting in the backyard. He was in his 80s, and she said, "A penny for your thoughts." And he said, "I was just roping them cows." Our backyard neighbor was Frank Wardlaw, who was the director of the University of Texas Press, a wonderful man, beloved, and J. Frank Dobie's good friend. And I taught at Southwestern University, which was his alma mater for over 30 years. And my office was in Mood Hall, which when Dobie was going there was the boys' dorm. So I like to think maybe I was even in J. Frank Dobie's room and sort of absorbing his charisma. I grew up in Dobie's Austin. It, at that time, was a small town with green lawns and the university and the Capitol and Barton Springs. But right on the other side of the river, there were living a folk that we later started to call the Cedar Choppers, who were very different. They lived in shacks with dirt floors. They killed their meat. They brewed moonshine whiskey, and they cut cedar posts to make a little bit of spending money. So let me start with when I first encountered the Cedar Choppers. I was about 10 or 11 years old, and one of my favorite things to do was to go down to the low water bridge, if you know Austin, right there on the river, right at the lake, and fish with my friend Dudley. And so we went down there one evening, and I'll just go ahead and read this, because it's okay, I think, here. I said, I could usually catch enough bluegills and bass for dinner, and sometime even a catfish. One afternoon, when we were 10 or 11, Dudley and I, my neighbor, rode down there, and we got off our bikes and scrambled down to the road, and there were 3 boys standing there in the middle of the path. And I remember how different from us they looked. They were barefoot, their pants were too short, they had ragged clothes, and they looked hard, tanned, skinny, dirty. These were not kids you'd see in Austin. In a few years, they opened up a bridge there in a junior high school called O. Henry, and you'd see a couple of them were coming over to school, but before then, they'd never even go beyond the 7th grade. They'd stay over in the hills and drop out of school. Well, these kids held up a stringer of fish, and they said in this hard, flat voice, "You want to buy some fish?" Well, my friend Dudley, who was a bad boy even then, said, if we wanted to buy fish, we'd go to the H-E-B. And I said, Dudley, they looked at us, and they looked away, and they walked away, and I said, Dudley, I don't think you should have said that to those boys, because not that I was really offended by it, but I figured they might take offense. And sure enough, in a few minutes, they came back, and one of them was holding a club. Now, Dudley was strong, and we were bigger than they were, and I think if they'd been normal West Austin kids, we could have won, but they were not normal, and they weren't West Austin kids. And there was a look in their eyes that said, we're going to fight until one of us is badly hurt. And so we ran. Well, that was my introduction at 10 years old, and that caused me to write this book, because I wanted to say, who are these people? Who are these people that live right next door to us? Well, I discovered that what they were called in the 1950s were the Cedar Choppers. And literally the newspapers would say, Cedar Chopper apprehended, Cedar Chopper robbed store. It's like they were white, but back in those days, in the early 50s, they'd say Mexican does this or Negro does that, you know? And they weren't going to call these folks white folks. They wouldn't say anything about white folks normally, but they'd call them cedar choppers because they were far down on that scale of whiteness. And what I learned is that they were Scots-Irish. They were people of Scots-Irish descent that had moved from Appalachia to the Ozarks to the hill country of Texas to where they could go no further. They had gone as far as they could as mountain boys. Further than that was West Texas, the Llano Estacado, right? And the subtitle of my book is Life on the Edge of Nothing, because they were on the edge of nothing. They could go no further than that. And they took their subsistence lifestyle there and they moved into the hills. And as the rest of the South just depopulated, you know, with the price of cotton and one thing and another, they hung on. And finally, in the 1940s, when we started fencing off everything and the farms were abandoned, fence posts soared in price and they started making money and they started coming into Austin, into the cedar yards and selling their cedar. They emerged from the hills in their ragged work clothes and they were hard, dirty, and aggressive, and the huge disparity between them and the people of Austin was exposed. Now, Dobie would have known about them. He was a folklorist, and fellow folklorist John Lomax and his son Alan recorded them actually singing in the hills west of Austin, old English ballads. The second person to get a Dobie Paisano Fellowship was A.C. Green, a great Texas writer. And he wrote an article for the Southwestern Quarterly that talked about them and how they stayed to themselves and they lived in a tribal fashion and they passed their living on to their sons and the son-in-laws. Well, one of his very best friends, Roy Bedichek, had a fellowship or was encouraged by Dobie and Webb to go out to Friday Mountain Ranch and write. And he spoke about them in one of his long walks. Here's what he had to say. He said, "I saw through an opening in the cedars a sight I shall never forget. An aged man cutting cedar. It was obviously the weight of years upon the trim, streamlined axe which had slowed it down. After a dozen or strokes or so, he leaned heavily on a tree, his chest heaving. As soon as his breathing quieted a little, he resumed his chopping. Slow, steady, and accurate to a hair. His gigantic frame was stripped to the waist. He was at least 6'2", broad shoulders tapering at the hips, with an almost wasp-like waist that accentuated by the belt drawn tautly about him." Well, Dobie never wrote about the cedar choppers, or even about the contrast. I saw a picture in a book of where he grew up, and it was a hardscrabble ranch. I mean, it looked like any hill country ranch house, and never even wrote about that contrast that I'm aware of between his upbringing and how he lived in Austin. So for this, I want you to listen to another Texas writer called Elroy Bodie, who came to the University of Texas around 1950 from a hardscrabble ranch near Kerrville. He says, "During my freshman year in college, I walked the nighttime streets of Austin and I looked into the houses, those with lush lawns and gold door knockers and polished staircases winding to second floors. And the thoughts I had inside me burned so much like hot metal that all I wanted to do was yell out into the surrounding darkness. This is not my life here. I am not from this world. I'm of a house that never had a proper thing, where closet doors never shut and faucets always dripped and dogs smelled like old grease." Well, if the contrast between the life on a ranch in the hill country was huge, imagine what it was like between the cedar choppers and Austin. This is literally where Appalachia and modernity met, right? This is what I wrote. If a kid, because I experienced this in West Austin, if a kid walked from his shack across the low water bridge into Terrytown, he would follow streets that were straight and clean and tree-lined, with white houses and green lawns and bright beds of flowers. The children there rode bicycles, and people went to house on sidewalks wearing nice clothes. If you walked up Exposition Boulevard to Windsor Road, there was a gas station and a grocery store and an air-conditioned pharmacy with a soda fountain, and next door a toy store with a sleek replica of a passenger airline hanging in the window. To a Cedar Chopper kid, it was another world. When Don Simons went with his dad on the regular Saturday morning moonshine run from Bull Creek to 6th Street, he would pass the golf course on Enfield. He said, I would see all those guys out there with those white golf shoes on and golf shirts. Man, I wanted to play golf. Another story of Cedar Chopper Bob Willis I interviewed in his mid-70s, and he was still hauling cedar all over Texas. And he talked about one time he was out on Highway 45 going into Houston, and he took a detour to have lunch, and he found himself in a sort of an area with cardboard houses and occupied by Mexican laborers. And he said this, he said, when I seen that, I thought about back when I was a little kid. And then you look to the left, that's what you'd see. But then you look to the right and you could see the city, the high buildings and the stuff down there. And I always thought we were so close to civilized country, but yet so far away. So I've been thinking a lot about this and Dobie and, what he didn't see or what he didn't write about and what he did write about. And I started I guess the thing that just fascinates me about Austin and Dobie and the Cedar Choppers is what different worlds we inhabit while living side by side. Here was Dobie, the intellectual, writing about worlds of South Texas and Mexico. There's the political world that he ran around in the Capitol and the university, the middle-class world of Tarrytown, the East Austin world of the poor blacks, and the hillbilly world of the Cedar Choppers. What a strange place Texas is. Do I have time for a little story? Short one? Hey, Margaret? Little short story, okay? This is just to give you an idea of how they were perceived in Austin. In the 1930s, 1920s, during Prohibition, there were stills all over the hills west of Austin, and they were brewing moonshine for the Capitol, for all those folks there. And there was this one deputy sheriff who always wanted to be sheriff. He wore a pearl-handled revolver and a real pretty white Stetson hat and polished boots, and he never got elected, but he wanted to be sheriff, and he wanted to bust this one Cedar Chopper living out by Bull Creek. And if you know Austin, you come down off of Mount Bunnell and you're driving down toward 360, and it crosses what's called Bull Creek. It's a real pretty area. My wife's sitting out there, and we used to go and study for final exams, drinking beer on Bull Creek. And so Sheriff McCoy drove out there in the late 1920s, 1930, and there was a big rock had fallen in the road. He couldn't go any further, so he starts walking. And he comes upon this Cedar Chopper kid. And the kid was probably put there for a reason, for a guard, I would imagine. But so he asked this kid, he says, do you know Jim Boatwright? And the kid says, yep, I know him. He says, well, you know where he lives? Yep, I know where he lives. Getting frustrated, he says, well, will you take me there? He said, yeah, I'll take you for $1. He says, okay. You take me up there, and when we come back, I'll give you $1. Kid says, hell, you ain't coming back. So that's the end of my Cedar Chopper stories for now. I'm not going on it.
You're not going anywhere yet. I got a couple of questions for you. Okay, like Dobie, you did not set out in your career to collect stories of a people. You were a professor of economics. Yet you collected the stories of the Cedar Choppers. Apart from your early experience that you mentioned in the beginning, was there one aha moment or experience that made you realize this is what you wanted to do or needed to do?
You were brilliant. Yes, there was.
Good.
She did not set me up for this.
I didn't. He didn't
she
know the question.
No, absolutely there was. I dedicated this book. In the very front, you'll see a picture of Ronnie Roberts. And I was just scared, man. I mean, it's one thing to interview people of a different culture, like Chinese or Mexican laborers, and, you know, do it through a translator or whatever. It's another thing to go to people you know, to people you know, like you. I mean, in some ways. And so I was just beating around the bush. How am I gonna really get into what I'm interested in, which was the clash of cultures? You know, that's really what was coming down. And so Ronnie and I are beating around the bush, and Ronnie finally says, Kenny, just stop for a minute. Let me tell you a little bit about my life. And he said, when I was about 6, my older brother, a couple years older, got a brain tumor, and he died. And he said, my mom got real depressed. My dad started drinking, and everything just fell to shit. And his mom committed suicide. His dad became an alcoholic, and he moved in with his grandparents along with his 2 sisters. And from then on, yes, I realized I had a responsibility. I mean, I had to tell it like it was, you know, because these people had lived this life that was so hard and so different from our life. And so yes, that was my aha moment. And I went, man, this is a serious thing I got to do, you know?
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
So I have one more question, and it may be a absolutely not answer, but when after you decided that this is what you were going to do, and you started gathering these stories, I know that you knew about Dobie and what he had done. Did it ever cross your mind that there were some parallels maybe of what you were doing and what he had done gathering stories?
You know, I didn't so much, but yeah. I mean, I have since then started thinking about, as a folklorist, of that's exactly what he was doing, was gathering stories. They were more removed from, maybe if not from him, but certainly from me. When I read them,
right,
they became more removed. They were a story of another, a vaquero or something like that. And these stories were stories of kids that I grew up with, you know. So that was a difference to me, you know.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Margaret.
Ken Roberts. Thank you so much.